few people within the TIFR system who is been very active in doing some of these modeling behaviors for analyzing the economic costs as well as the probability features for the nuclear industry. So, yeah, I saw your hand up first. Go ahead.
There are a couple of quick points, some questions. One is, you are taking a view, taking a dividing standard broadly, those who are in conflict with the state and those who are collaborating. Collaborating not in bad sense necessarily, but it can that sense can also be there. But beyond these, there can be ways of engagement, more constructive. In fact, one you cited 2005 patent case. Delhi Science Forum people were involved. There was a particular regime that was there where the pressure of left party was there, and that's why that law was not entirely how it was wished by pharma companies. So that kind of engagement. So taking a necessarily conflictual view by active scientists can also be counterproductive, considering the existing state where the forces are already shaped so heavily against you. That is one. And second quick point is, actually, you shared your apprehensions about scientists. In democratic movement, we are facing a different problem where there is a new obscurantism with a radical veneer. Where a blanket anti-nuclear, blanket even disrupting GM trials, that kind of positions are being taken. The anti-neutrino lab protests which have now started. And there are these sociological fancy theories calling science as inherently oppressive. The Shiv Vishwanathan kind of people. So considering that problem, then in lieu of that, how does or how do you see the role of scientists facing up to this kind of new, seemingly radical obscurantism?
So thanks. Yeah, those are very good questions. So let me just say about the first thing. The engagement of Delhi Science Forum and to some extent the other left parties, which, as you say, brought in these aspects of the Indian patent law, which is what the conflict was about, is actually precisely the kind of thing I was talking about. So it doesn't have to be necessarily conflict. Maybe conflict is not the right word, but I was roughly trying to categorize it into So these categories are hazy, but this entire intervention where you try and push something against what the industry wants, or you try and intervene in issues of science policy, it doesn't necessarily have to get you in conflict, but that's a certain level of engagement, which is what I was trying to categorize. So it doesn't have, conflict is a broad theme, and it's true that when you have scientists who engage in policy at this kind of level, they are in conflict with the state. But I'm not trying to, let's say that that's necessarily something which is essential, or conflict is something that should be, that's necessarily positive. And in fact, the engagement that you're talking about in terms of engaging in the law and trying to put in certain clauses, similar things happened, for example, with nuclear liability legislation, where there was, which is one reason why a lot of this Indian nuclear expansion has been held up, because of a somewhat progressive aspect clause in the Indian law, and that's something that's positive, and it would be great if more scientists were to engage in that. So that's precisely the kind of engagement I'm speaking about. But the second issue of this radical obscurantism is not something I'm sure I agree with. I think that really the central problem that occurs here. Let's take this example of the neutrino observation. So it's something we can discuss more. But clearly, so there are probably some legitimate questions that people can have about the environmental impact assessment and so on. And then there are some completely unreasonable, totally incorrect fears that people have about the dangers of neutrinos. So people fear that neutrinos will be used for weapons, or will be used, will have health impacts, and that's something that's totally unreasonable. But now, at this point, I think that so far it's clear. But I think at this point one has to recognize that the reason these fears are able to take hold is because of the great lack of transparency that is present in other dealings of the state with the society. Yes. So if on a nuclear reactor you go and tell them, or something else where there is actually a genuine danger, you tell them, chance of an accident is 1 in infinity, then you refuse to take liability. So people can see that that's something where you're clearly lying. Now you go and tell them, actually a neutrino is totally harmless, which it is. But there's no reason, there's not necessarily a clear way that people have of parsing truth from falsehood. So I think that the reason that these issues are taking place, really the responsibility lies with the scientific community because it has failed to engage transparently and honestly with people. So I think the neutrino observatory is a good example, and it's true that there are fears which are unfounded which are being raised there, but I think that really the responsibility lies with the fact that on very similar issues and related issues, there's been a total lack of transparency and honesty. So now there are, if someone comes and says, oh, these guys were lying there, they're also lying here, it's very hard to, go and say, oh no, they were lying there, but in this situation they're telling the truth. So I think, and in general, it's not something that I'm worried about so much, because, in this case, not only is truth on your side, in the sense that it is truth, neutrinos are harmless, you also have all the powers of the state, and, basically, you have all the, you basically have all the powers that be on your side. So given that situation, this is not something that I find that is a very serious concern that
Not a particular example, tendency I was referring to.
I'm not sure what this tendency is. These are specific examples that I speak about, but I'm not sure that there's some general postmodernist tendency that has arisen, but now one can argue about postmodernism and whether and surely that's something that I disagree with, but I'm not sure that that's
Can I build on that?
So I think there are lots of hands. Let's not. So the person in red, then something. Apologies. I'm even going off. Okay, great. It's amazing. I mean, unfortunately, it's an exam and we can't make this public, but it is just so fantastic. There is a huge hangar at the Bombay Exhibition Center with 430 parallel experimental stations, which where the kids can come and do their experiments. It's a mega setup.
Okay. The Olympiad.
Yeah, with the Olympiad.
The physics Olympiad.
So, Dr. Raju, thank you for this talk. It's a very important topic, and you listed several reasons why scientists find it difficult. Wrongly, perhaps, but I thought there was one missing, which is the deep-seated prejudices which these scientists themselves hold. So, for example, when NPR interviewed the scientists who were responsible for the Mars mission, they found that a lot of these scientists have very strong astrological beliefs. So, do you want to comment on that, or?
I'm not sure that's actually that's not something I have personally found to be a very significant problem. I have to say that there is personal, there are sometimes social prejudices that may be strong. There are social prejudices that may be strong. Sometimes there are casteist prejudices that may be strong, which come to the fore. There are other, if you look at, for example, this issue that happened in IIT Madras, this Ambedkar-Periyar issue, I think there are other prejudices. But the issue of superstition in scientists is not something I have personally encountered. But I don't feel that that's a very significant issue. I think there are other social prejudices which are important. But that's my own personal opinion. You want to say something?
So I find that the scientists are going to use theorems. If they can combine theorems with the realities of life, they'll be more effective. For example, US started the latest reactor, power reactor last year, or beginning of this year, after many years, and they're planning not to have one more. Japan has 49, 50 reactors that they will probably restart, but they're not planning even a single more. In France and Germany, which have 30% to 5% nuclear power, they are not planning any more. So can we not combine these two facts that except for India and China, all the countries who believed in nuclear power, Japan, which has no other fuel, they have to import, and they were going for new reactors, and they have decided not to. And we are the only ones talking about it. I sometimes fear if something happens to reactor in Bombay, they will be all go. We have no plans to get out. We don't know what will happen. So why are, if we only use theorems, which can be proved right or wrong, probabilities can be this way or that way. As you rightly said, why are they not accepting the liability when it is so insignificant? And US companies and the French companies which are working, they don't want to accept liability because it's not insignificant. It is significant.
Yes. No, so I agree with broadly what you say, but the issue of there shouldn't be mimicry. Just because, just to say, it's true that the US is planning some of these 81,000 reactors. There's this project in Georgia that they're planning to set. And so some of these reactors may be actually constructed. So there was talk of this nuclear renaissance in the US, which it's true has gone down, but the US will probably construct some new reactors, including the 81,000 design.
Last report of economics said that they are not allowing it.
No,
And that's what they said.
There are significant economic hurdles. So the significant thing that's holding forward this nuclear renaissance is that there's the economic hurdles. And I think that's something that's actually very important, which we can learn a lot. So, for example, there is, if you look at, the US has estimates, but if you look at these EPR reactors, if you're planning for Delta, it's pretty close to here. Two of these reactors are being constructed in Europe. One of them is in Flamanville, in Finland, and the other is in Flamanville in France, and Olkiluoto in Finland. These reactors are actually under construction, so there's no reactor of this kind in operation, so these reactors are under construction. And we have a pretty good idea of the kind of costs that they incur. So they're both incurred more than $10 billion in costs, and maybe $12 billion in costs. And the initial cost estimates were 1/3 of these, 1/4 of these. The initial time estimates were about 3 to 4 years, and now these things have, these time estimates have escalated to 10 to 13 years and so on. So it's not that Europeans aren't building these reactors; they are building these reactors, these EPR reactors. But both in France and in Finland. But in those places, the build is in significant trouble. In fact, as a result of the build being in significant trouble, the company Areva, which is building these reactors, its most recent bond rating is now junk. So it's what's called a junk rating. So this is something we can learn from. There's no reason that India needs to go and buy 6 reactors priced at $10 billion each from this junk-rated company. And it's really very reminiscent of what happened in Enron. Even the political dynamics of how the certain people opposed it when they were in the opposition, and now they support it and they're in the government. In fact, even the place, it's happening in Ratnagiri. So many things are very reminiscent of Enron. The fact that this crumbling company with this technology which is very expensive is failed in other places. So I think that's something that we can learn from. But in general, if France decides to go ahead with more nuclear reactors, they can. They can make an independent judgment based on their experience. So I think.
But they have decided that 30% and 50%, they are not going to have any more. They may have 1 or 2 or 3, but that percentage which was very good for them, no more.
Yeah, but it doesn't. We don't have to base our decision on what I'm just saying. I agree with you broadly in the kind of conclusion I'm reaching, but I'm just saying the one thing I find troubling about the line of argument is we don't have to base our decision on the decision that France makes or Germany makes or the US makes. Although we can look at the economic experiences there and learn from them.
So if they cannot afford, how can India afford?
Well, so first of all, the tricky thing about that is, I'm just saying that, the tricky thing about that is, first of all, that these companies are, a lot of European and American, so the US is probably going to construct some new nuclear reactors. So the danger of an argument of this kind is that sometimes we find that France can actually afford, because, Areva and EDF are such major French companies. It will probably succeed or may succeed in pushing the flammable reactor through. Or maybe the UK will decide to spend, £8 billion on a reactor of this kind. So whether so they may actually succeed in affording some of these things. But I'm just saying that the danger of saying that, look, the US and France are not doing it, therefore we shouldn't do it, is that tomorrow if they do it for whatever reasons of their own, then your argument is unvalid. That's all.
Can we learn from Japan?
But yes, I think we can learn from Japan. So I think Japan is clearly a very special kind of situation where there's been a significant. I'm not saying we shouldn't learn. I'm just saying that we should. This is not the end of the argument to say that Western countries are doing it and therefore we should do it. I'm saying we should learn from them.
Can we not combine the two?
Yes, I agree. We can certainly combine the two, and I'm not disagreeing with your conclusion. I'm just saying if we end the argument that it can get undercut if tomorrow they change their policy, which they might. Now there is an military industrial, atomic industrial complex that exists in these countries as well. So if we tie our policy to them. Tomorrow they change that, it shouldn't just be blind following, that's all.
Who's making the decision to buy these nuclear reactors?
Who's made the decision to buy these nuclear?
Yes, who's making the decision? Government?
Yes, the government of India. So it was a decision.
Are you taking the advice of the scientists?
No, clearly not. It's a political. It's a political decision.
Responsible for buying these nuclear reactors?
I think it's a political decision. It's a political decision that the previous government made as part of the Indo-US nuclear deal. It had many motivations. It had some foreign policy motivations. It had to do with this whole issue of getting access to international nuclear markets. But
this energy which we are trying to produce is only for defense.
No, it's not independent.
Which is the other area where this nuclear.
So the BARC didn't have any influence on this?
No. Well, I think that a lot of these major decisions that were made, such as the decision to buy 6 reactors, the promised set of reactors that India wants to buy from Areva, they're supposed to buy 6 reactors, of which they're supposed to buy 2 immediately and some later. There are 4 reactors they're going to buy from General Electric. They're called the Economic Simplified Boiling Water Reactors. They're going to be installed in Kovada. 4 reactors they're going to buy from Westinghouse.
What is the requirement of buying this?
Huh?
What is the requirement?
The requirement is the requirement is that
Society also requires energy to develop. It's also the development agenda, which is also there.
Yes.
It's a socio-economically related thing. It's certainly a political statement, but it's a very loaded statement. It's also the socio-economic requirement of the country and of the population of the country.
But let me just say that I think that in this issue, the choice of this particular technology, when you might require electricity, you could ask, was Enron a good thing? When Enron came into being, this was precisely what was said. We need electricity. So the choice of a particular technology is so this choice of these technologies is extremely problematic. There is clearly no objective need to get these things. So the question is that, there's no, forget about that. If you want to buy something in India, you want to buy a laptop, you need to go through a tender process. You need to get 3 bids and so on. Where were the bids that were taken for buying the $60 billion reactors, 6 of these reactors? Where were the bids for, for Kovada, for Miti? In fact, not even that. These are actually even bigger than that.
Scientists cannot put this.
This is something that's actually well known. So, if, for example, if this economic simplified boiling water reactor didn't even exist, the letter of intent from the Indian government saying we want to buy 4 of these was sent in 2008. This reactor got regulatory clearance in the US from the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2014. So the reactor didn't even exist when they promised to buy it. So they promised to buy it even before the technology existed. So this is clearly a political decision that's being made. Now the issue is, but it's true that I feel there hasn't been enough of an outcry about this. And there could have been enough of an outcry about these issues, that this is a technology which is economically expensive, just analyzing the costs of these things.
More scientists should be making decisions regarding
No.
I think we can wait. We have some questions lined up. Yeah.
I just want to come back to the issue why scientists don't get involved in this. There are 2 things. One is definitely what you pointed out, that most of the science in India is funded by government agencies, so people don't want to get into a conflict with government. That's a very valid point, and that's something which needs to be corrected by industry, by something like that. Maybe a crowdfunding of science research in India, something like that. Second thing I would like to say is that one of the biggest lacunae in the scientific community also is the personality of the basic scientist. A scientist by default is an introvert person. Second thing is, many scientists in India lack communication skills. Okay, and that probably also could be an hindrance by many scientists. How many really, honestly speaking, how many of the best, you studied in the best colleges, how many of the best colleges in India, the faculty who's really great in science and research is the best teacher? So the whole problem lies also with communication. And that's probably why the scientist community is also staying away. I think that's very important that institutions also start coaching scientists in the whole communication, mass communication also.
I would put it slightly differently. I think it's true that there is some level of disengagement between science and society, because there's a disengagement between scientific institutes and humanities and social science institutes in India. And therefore there's a lack sometimes of social sensitivity, because that's not something that, if you look at the IITs, there's some level that there isn't really, an interplay between science and humanities, and so there's to some extent a lack of social engagement. So I think more than a personality trait, I think there's a systemic problem which has to do with the lack of this institutional engagement. The issue of funding, I think, is very important, but I don't think actually that industry or private sources can actually substitute for the government.
I think purely, I think if India can innovate in this own stuff, then we can actually have a crowd-funded scientific
movements.
I think there's a better solution which actually does exist, and the solution is that science funding should be transparent and done by an autonomous body. And there should be some transparent process of science funding. It shouldn't be that some secretary of some government decides that, I'm going to fund X institute by this amount and Y institute by this amount and accept this funding proposal and not accept that funding proposal. If the process of funding is transparent, then it becomes much harder, if there's some transparent evaluation and funding process, it becomes much harder to tamper with this. You can't say, I'm going to cut your grant because, somebody in your institute is doing something which I don't like. Because there's some justification that has to be made. So I think that the requirement is of changing the funding structure to make it more transparent and autonomous. That's a very hard thing to do. But I would suggest that's the solution, not that there's private participation.
norms exactly are very difficult to define.
No.
Even the US does better in this, for example. The US does much better in terms of this kind of grant funding. It's not that somebody sitting somewhere, some bureaucrat can just decide to fund X or not fund X. So there's many places do better in terms of this. Not that the US is ideal, the US has many problems.
But just an extension on this. If I only scientists, working for any company as an employee, and if you take a stand which is contrary to the management stand,
You're in trouble.
you will be suffering. And if you feel so strongly about that anti-management stand, the only thing the course that you have is to leave the job and pursue that, right? So how scientists are different? Because if somebody is funding you, somebody is paying you to do something which that management wants, and you are taking a stand, maybe social. I'm not denying the fact, right? Why would they permit you to take
It's an inappropriate argument, I think, in this situation, because it's not that the government has some private interest which it can define, and they can say, we want to buy these reactors which we have decided. The management of India has decided we want to buy 6 reactors from Areva. They're going to cost $60 billion. Now, if you speak out against it, then you're speaking against the management. Therefore, go away. Now, these 6 reactors they're buying are reactors they're buying with public money. So the objective of this management or whatever it is the government is to have public good. And in that, academics have a very important public role, which is the role of having public debate. And so that's something which the government has to, just because it's a funding agency, it's not like they're paying money out of their pocket. It's not like, they're not paying money for these public policies out of their pocket as well. So I'm not sure it's an appropriate analogy between a private company and between publicly funded universities. Publicly funded universities, in the end, there has to be some public accountability. It's not like there's some management which can make arbitrary decisions.
You're talking about the awareness part of it, because it's very difficult that many of us would be aware about whether this is the right technology or this is the right economic price to pay. Today it's very easy to create an awareness, right? You can go to Facebook, you can go to Twitter, and just put a point, and we can research on that and then make our opinion and start talking with the government or with the people. So forget about taking a stand. Why the awareness cannot be created? At least that can be done.
I think it's not, it's not, anything I'm saying is not in the public domain if you search for it. It is in the public domain, but in general, I think we need more participation and more of, generally more intellectuals and more scientists to step forward and take responsibility and analyze some of these issues, which is something that they're capable and they're able to do. So it's I just feel that's a requirement that they need to do. Now it's true that in principle anyone can, if does enough, spends enough time, can do these things. But there's a responsibility that academics and public intellectuals have to do this, and that's something I think we should take up more than they have been taking.
Yeah, Vinay.
I have a question. What can the scientist community do to bring our food labels on par with other countries? For example, what's the story behind nature identical flavoring substances label, which is unique to products which may be made by MNCs abroad but are meant to be sold in India? Prior to the creation of this label, all food additives were clearly mentioned but are now hidden behind this label. So there's a real need for the scientists to look out for consumers' interest from food labels which inform consumers that their cold coffee, for example, is made from cheaper and heart disease-inducing hydrogenated oil derivatives instead of milk, to perhaps some legislation which prevents a product from being called coffee if it contains anything other than what the consumers expect.
I'm not an expert in this, I don't have much to add to this. This is clearly an important issue. This is an important issue that should be taken up by people who work with this. I don't have anything very specific to add to this. This is not the kind of thing. If someone else would like to take,
I can only add to one thing. How many people know that there is this Grahak Jagran Manch and Mumbai Grahak Panchayat in the city? I think those people are taking up those issues, and we should be members of such movement in case we want to fight all this adulteration and even your genetically modified food and other things is being talked about, and they are doing pretty good work. I think those organizations also need to be strengthened. Of course, the scientists will at some point of time be able to give you something about the genetically modified food, but this is a completely consumer affair thing, and best addressed by this Grahak Manch kind of people.
And they are the ones who will go to the scientists for the...
Yeah, they will go to scientists, yes, but eventually there are the bodies of this kind. This Consumer Education and Research Society in
Ahmedabad, they are all following up these things. So scientists per se do not have any role. Only thing is that they will probably analyze whether the genetically modified food is good for your health or not. But then also for that thing, you don't have one human's time span to judge whether it's good or not, and we don't have that kind of time span. Yeah.
So this is not exactly posing you as a scientist, but we have two very hostile neighbors, China and Pakistan, who are very active in nuclear warfare. So when we are talking about denuclearizing our own military, how much at risk we are putting ourselves as a country, equivalent to the fact that having a nuclear plant is also quite disastrous for the country itself.
So I think the issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy can be separated. I think that the idea that there's this mutually assured destruction idea, that if you have a lot of nuclear weapons, and this is what has happened with Pakistan in the past few years, if you have a lot of nuclear weapons and someone else has a lot of nuclear weapons, and somehow both of you are safer because both of you are scared that you will destroy each other, and therefore neither of you will use this. It's called the man theory appropriately, because it is mutually assured destruction. It is a man theory. But it's not, it's not actually a good theory. And I think that we should recognize often in these issues that internal security actually comes from totally different setups. If you look at Cuba, for example, it has resisted the American onslaught without having nuclear weapons. You look at what has happened in Venezuela. It has resisted a very strong US onslaught, maintained a society and some social setup there. Totally independent of having nuclear.
They haven't been attacked nuclearly.
Well, they haven't been attacked. The idea
there was a
that
military invasion into the territory.
But I think the idea, well, actually, Cuba was attacked. But I think the idea that a country can just go and bomb, put a nuclear bomb on somebody is not quite how it works. I think in the end, if there is internal cohesion, that's a much stronger way to achieve internal security and defense than nuclear weapons. You look at the Soviet Union, which did have a lot of nuclear weapons, but which fell apart because of internal contradictions. So I think that the idea that nuclear weapons increase security is very troubling, and particularly if there's an arms race like what has happened with Pakistan, it certainly decreases security because it leads to a situation where some small misunderstanding, and these are things that could have happened many times. The number of cases, you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we came very close to a large-scale nuclear war. So in general, over a slightly longer period, mutual armament reduces security for all countries in the world. So clearly, the only way to have security is through disarmament, not through mutual armament. I think that's very important.
No, but individually disarming our own country, and how do we?
It's not like, I really don't feel that there is some threat that Pakistan is going to come and put a nuclear bomb on Delhi at some point. I feel that's the idea that this is something that will happen is really not something that we should take seriously. And in fact, even from a very conventional military viewpoint, the nuclear blast, so it's not that first of all there's individual disarmament, there was individual armament. There were nuclear tests that were carried out in India in '98, and even before that, the so-called peaceful nuclear explosion, the 70s, was actually a nuclear test. That is what has even from a totally hawkish conventional military viewpoint, it's actually annulled a lot of the conventional military superiority that Indian forces had. So this kind of idea. So I think that stepping down and de-escalation with some idea of mutual de-escalation. So when you talk about disarmament, there has to be some notion of a nuclear-free Asia, nuclear-free world, and there has to be, of course, a global attempt towards disarmament. That global attempt can't be carried out if you're arming. So if you look at what the US is doing, where they are totally in violation of their own NPT obligations, which include disarmament in a time-bound frame, and then they want to say we'll stop proliferation. It's just not something that cuts any water. On the other hand, if the US were to cut nuclear weapons, it would help a lot in stopping proliferation and creating global disarmament. I think India is actually, as a dominant power in South Asia, can do a lot by disarming and setting an example, and it's not, I think, so hard to achieve mutual, I don't know if it's so hard or not, but I think it's certainly feasible and thinkable if we can achieve mutual disarmament. Yeah.
So, my question was this, that firstly, in your talk today, you focused more on organized ways in which science, in your first slide, you showed that people's science movements have taken two focuses, and one is against certain issues, and second is against only one issue, which is scientific temper. So considering that, there are lots of non-state actors which threaten such activities and such scientists, And so how do you best counter it? And as you said, these are just fringe elements of the society, and by and large, so society is conducive for that.
So there are two issues. The question he was asking was about non-state actors who promote obscurantism from a different viewpoint. There are also non-state actors who promote, which happen to be in power in the country right now, promote obscurantism from a, from. So the idea of that, whatever, there was a head transplant, Ganesh had a head transplant, or the idea that there was a Viman which used to fly forward, backwards, or whatever that we heard in Indian Science Congress, is a slightly different level of obscurantism from the one that you spoke about, I think, which was so that's a slightly different level of obscurantism, and that is certainly a threat which needs to be combated. And I think we are combating it. My feeling is actually that that's something which is recognized, and in the long run, this is just my feeling. In the long run, I don't feel that these kinds of obscurantist ideas actually have any hope of surviving. The idea that Ganesh there was plastic surgery and that's why Ganesh has an elephant's head or whatever, is this idea, which all of you know was announced in a hospital inauguration in Bombay, is not something which is going to, which has any hope of lasting. So it's something everyone recognizes kind of. So, but of course it needs to be fought because it happens to be in currency. The idea that you can calculate the frequency of a nuclear accident and you find that it's 2.41 into 10 to the minus 7 is at some level as absurd, but it's not recognized that it's as absurd. So that's what I wanted to focus on. The kinds of things you're talking about are very important, but they also recognize that there is mobilization against them, and there needs to be more mobilization against them. In fact, the milk miracle happened, which clearly didn't happen, and there is a recognition of that and mobilization against that. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying the problem is recognized and there's some efforts on that. But there are other problems which I feel are not recognized.
One more thing.
We are running short of time, so we'll see if we can go in for a second round later on. Yeah. What a person. Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's an analog to what I say now. In the US, recently Ted Cruz, this guy named Ted Cruz. So he is actually the chairman of the Senate subcommittee which is overlooking NASA. And he is a strong denier of global warming, which is obviously pretty bad. So what he did was, after coming into power, he actually tried to suppress the funding for NASA Earth Science Division. So I'm pretty sure that there might be analogs to this in all countries. So what should be done for such cases where obviously a person who is not intellectually capable is completely stopping what is the most important thing right now, doing earth science?
I think it's very valid. By the way, if you look at this book by James Hansen, who used to work at NASA, called Storms of My Grandchildren, he explicitly mentions this. This is something that the Bush administration was also doing. So he talks about it in his book. The Bush administration, when James Hansen was talking about a lot of these climate change things, tried to intimidate his junior colleagues and him and tried to threaten funding for NASA. It's precisely the kind of thing that happens here. So it's certainly a problem that exists in other places. One needs to make it public and mobilize against it and fight against it. So I agree, it's certainly a global problem. It's a problem that, and yes, it's something that's also documented actually. It's precisely like the issue that happens here. So there needs to be a stronger pushback against something like this kind. Yeah, so you should look at this book by James Hansen, Storms of My Grandchildren, which he talks about this explicitly.
So how can one change the outlook of the government to promote research facilities on campus? Like for astronomy and other applied sciences, all the research funding goes to TIFR, and PhD students, not all, but most of the funding goes to institutions like these. There are very few institutions that offer on-campus research, like IITs and IISCs. And also, what is the purpose behind 50 to 60% reservation when the level that used to be of the caliber that you have to possess to get into an IIT is very high, and for reservations it's very, very low?
Very frankly speaking, you are wrong on several counts. Past decade or decade and a half more, government has been trying to fund up many more institutions. And Indian Institute, actually, to tell you very frankly, TIFR is an offspring of Indian Institute of Sciences. Earlier it was called as Tata Institute of Sciences. It's wrong to just start a blame game that government is trying to fund only the centers of higher learning like TIFR, Indian Institute of Sciences or something of that sort. It's not true. Universities are equally funded. Unfortunately, there are no takers over there because the community itself feels, oh, it is quite derogatory to do a PhD in a university rather than this ivory towers of science which you feel. It's not so. One, you should look at the amount of money that has been spent by the government for ICERs, NICERs. There is a Center for Excellence in Basic Sciences in Mumbai University. The next speaker is going to be from there. So I think you are sort of wrong on that count. It's not that. Government is trying to fund equally well all the universities. Unfortunately, the people do not want to go to the universities. That's wrong.
Let me disagree with that a little bit. So, I think it's true that, well, I'll actually, let me agree with you a little bit. I think it's true that there is an asymmetry in funding. At some point when the UGC was set up, the University Grants Commission was set up, the budget of TIFR was larger than the entire budget of the University Grants Commission, which is clearly a problem. And I think it's
Yes,
but I think it's still true that as maybe if you write a grant from TIFR, it's very, as you were discussing just a couple of days ago, it's very startup grants in TIFR are very easy to get at a certain level. It's not easy to get at other institutes. So there is an asymmetry in funding. I would say that the solution to that is that there should be what we said earlier. There should be a transparent and academic evaluation. There should be a transparent funding process and an academic evaluation process. So that just because you happen to be sitting in an institute which is a prominent institute, you're not able to get your grant through, but somebody else is who's maybe doing better work sitting in a university is able to is not able to get a grant through, but someone from a prominent institution does. And I think that just having more transparency and having an honest and clear academic evaluation of grants and of scientific research funding will help a lot. And right now, I find that that's totally not the case. So I think that the funding situation needs to be changed. It's true that there is some money that's going into building new institutions, but I think it's fair that certainly universities don't have the same level of funds at all that institutions do. I remember at some point talking about. Just in St. Stephen's College is such a well-known college. Just the annual budget for physics experiments was so small. A few years ago, it was maybe a lakh or something like that, 2 lakhs per year. Now it may increase, but that was the situation a few years back. And that's certainly very bad. And St. Stephen's College is a very rich college actually. It's one of the richest colleges. You correct me.
The asymmetry is there, but it's not as much as in last.
Something you have to also appreciate that a lot of this is because of what has happened in the past. There was an asymmetry. That has led to people migrating in certain sectors, which has led to a lower quality of the universities on an average. I'm not saying that everybody in the university is not doing well. So these things sort of have a tendency of equilibrating. So if you take the situation right now, you will find on an average that better quality of research, better scientists are in these so-called elite institutions. And the universities, one of the first things I heard about research in India and funding in India when I was planning to move back was that often a lot of money is sent back to the government because there are not enough good proposals. Okay? But I strongly believe that unless we fix the bottom, none of these elite institutions can function. Where are we going to get our people from? Okay? So you lose all if you don't provide good facilities and good training at the end. And the thing is, there is some realization of that, and there is an effort with the help of ICERs and all, but a lot more needs to be done. But it cannot be fixed overnight. By tomorrow, suddenly flooding, taking all the funding away from the elite institutions and putting it into this. Money won't work like that. It has to be done gradually and with a fair and transparent process where the merit is given on your scientific proposal and not because from where you come from. Okay. So it's going to be a long process, but it has to be done.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very
good. A lot of my colleagues, senior colleagues, sit on this project review committees and other things, and they always complain that not many good projects are coming from these things. So how do you fund a second-rate or a third-rate project? And so money is there. There are not enough takers. The asymmetry is because of the bottom line.
No, but it has happened because of
so we need to correct that.
But there's also an issue of what kind of projects would be funded. So for example, let's say there's a Center for Sustainable Technologies. Would a project from there be funded to the same level as some project that one does, which may be something that that can get, maybe something from here won't get published in Nature. Let's say you publish something in some fancy journal. May find it much easier to get money from that than it is to find money for something that may actually be socially useful. And I think the issue of transparent grant funding and what is it that you're doing, I think is very, very important in that. And there isn't actually this. It's actually a social question. I think there needs to be more social questioning of this whole issue and more social engagement and a social awareness of where a lot of this public money is going and how it's being used. And that's certainly something which is very important, and I agree with you that it's very important.
No, transparency is required. Transparency is required. That's no issue. Yeah, young man here.
Why did the government stop
It's
Good one.
What was the question? This question about teaching program where Arvind Gupta and Kahar and other people, we were working together. From a lot of people, Vijay Arora and other people were working from DIFR. It was stopped for a totally different reason.
Arvind Gupta taught that.
Yes, same.
The offensive reason that was given for stopping this, the reason they said they are giving for stopping it is that at some point the project, funding expired, and then they had to renew it, and then they did a study of outcomes. And the reason they gave was that so this is not necessarily the true reason, but the given reason was that the outcomes of students studying in, so with a different syllabus and different textbooks, so students studying via this syllabus was not better in class 10 than students studying by the conventional syllabus. And that's why that was the reason the government gave. In fact, I think the reason was more complicated. There were complaints by, it was the Congress government, it's a political thing, there was a Congress government at that time in Madhya Pradesh, but there were complaints from BJP MLAs about, these progressive and scientists being allowed access to schools, whereas, their own organizations couldn't get access to schools. And that's the reason, in the end, the Congress government came into that kind of pressure and I think pulled the plug on funding. But I don't know how to explain it in a simpler way, except just to say that even basic science education is not something that's free of ideological, attitude and intent. And there are many people who would like to modify even basic science education to suit their ideological needs. And that, in some sense, I feel was at the heart of cutting, the portion of our science teaching. That would be my impression. There may be people here who are involved with that actually.
Yeah. Hi, my question is that there are a lot of people, people at large are scientifically illiterate. Most people are unaware of how the process of science is done. And one of the caricatures that you put up that caught my eye were these hands of various different corporations. The one hand which was military hand, another one was pharma. Those are very easy to vilify. But emotions and anecdotes are way more powerful than objectivity. For example, you can easily say that green tech is the new thing and renewable energy is the way to go, etc. But you have this giant solar farm in the United States, for example, which heats up water and it looks like it's a lake of birds and it's killing millions of birds, for example. And there's this long wind farms that are also killing birds. So my question is, how do you disseminate the correct information to the public when it is so easily manipulated by either governments or private organizations, or how do you how is that? What are your solutions?
My impression is actually that I feel that we should give people a lot more respect than we sometimes give them. That if there is genuine good information out there, it's something that has an impact. I think something people can pass and they can recognize. Now it's true that the kind of information that vested interests would like to put out is something that deliberately tries to confuse issues, and that's something that we find on a lot of issues. So on the issue of intellectual property rights, on the issue of nuclear energy, or a lot of these issues, you will find that there is information that's put out by vested interests who want a certain outcome, which deliberately tries to confuse the issue. And that's actually a reason that this phrase that you use of scientific illiteracy or scientific misinformation. There's a deliberate reason to try and keep people that way, because we like to push certain policies.
Well, there are also lobbies. You could educate everybody about, say, the law of mass action, but people will still go to the homeopath more. So I mean, there's a lot of existing misinformation or
maybe that's true. But can I say something about this? I feel that a lot of these things don't come back to the fact that people are. I think we should be very careful before we say people are stupid, because people actually aren't. So
I didn't mean to suggest that people are
let me say something
stupid.
about homeopathy.
Just
It's an interesting point. You see, it's true that homeopathy probably there's no scientific way it can work. So we realize that. But the reason I think people go to homeopathy, if you look at it a little deeper, is not because they're superstitious, but because there are very significant problems with the conventional medical systems and the way doctors and the medical industry interact with people. So if you go somewhere and you find that a doctor has just cheated you, he's given you something, or he's prescribed a treatment that's totally unnecessary, or he's done some surgery that's totally unnecessary, there is no, obviously you will be skeptical of that. And then it's not surprising that people take that skepticism one step forward and are like, for some chore and why don't we go to the homeopathy? And maybe he has something to say. So I think this issue of the nuclear project was as an analogous example. And it's true that people end up believing things that are unscientific or irrational. But if one looks a step deeper, there is a significant problem behind that. And the problem here is that the conventional medical system does not engage people honestly, does not give you information. When I go to a doctor, I'm always very scared. What is he? No, it's true. Just someone who looks into this, what is he going to say? And is he going to prescribe some treatment that's unnecessary? Or is he going to do something which will actually end up harming me rather? And there are many cases which all of us, certainly I don't know, where patients get harmed because the doctors want money from that. And this is the root of, I think. I really feel this is one of the roots of.
So, my question is, so how do you really go about disseminating the correct
information? The point is to contest the misinformation that's put out by the establishment. That's really the central problem. So I feel that if one contests, the malpractices in this conventional central medical community, or one contests malpractices in, put out propaganda that's put out by governments and corporations, that really will help a lot. And then a lot of these things are kind of side effects, there's obscurantism and homeopathy and so on. I have a feeling they will go away if the conventional setup can be transparent. That's my feeling.
This is a question.
Dolly the sheep was cloned, and at that time there was a lot of scientific uproar. People were saying that scientists are playing God, cloning stem cells. But then now, years later, today, stem cells are being used to cure people. So, is it true that scientists give up opinions before looking at the long-term effects of what they are doing?
That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah, it's certainly true that in many issues there is a significant ethical debate that needs to be that needs to be had, and that needs to be had more honestly. I don't know what to say more specifically to that. It's certainly it's a hard question to answer about the ethics of this. But once again, I feel that if there was so I don't have a very good answer to that question. But I feel that if there was a more honest and a more debate where people were more informed about this, it would help a lot also in making ethical decisions of this kind. So where stem cell research in the US, for example, was banned for religious grounds because George Bush decided that he didn't want to support it. Things of this kind, I think, could have been stopped if there was in general more scientific awareness. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I don't have a sharper answer.
Yeah, that question here.
This is the question which is like something which doesn't affect the people directly socially. It's about studying astronomy and astrophysics, right? Why mostly common people ask me that why should we study this if it doesn't affect us right now or directly? So I study astronomy, astrophysics because I like it. I'm curiosity driven, but how can we explain common people that okay, this is the field that should be like kind of, this also needs funding to know that even astrophysics, astronomy people need funding. So how do you convince common people that this is also one of the necessary field of science which needs to be studied?
Yeah, can I interpret this? Yeah, I think that a lot of So that's certainly the job of scientists, to try and explain the significance of their results and try and do this. Something that, let me try and turn your question around a little bit. I feel that actually right now for people like us, we have to do too little of that. We have to do too little of trying to explain why what we're doing is interesting. And maybe it relates to a question that you asked something like that. We actually are able, we don't actually even have to justify often why at least in places like the IFA and so on, why it is that you get funded. In fact, I think we should have to do more of that, to try to explain and justify why it is that what we're doing is interesting. But these questions have answers, I think. For questions that people are asking, I think they can try and justify genuinely why what they're doing is interesting. Maybe in some cases they'll fail, and in that case they should bear the consequences of that also. But I think that these questions have answers. There's some specific question you can ask about astronomy and astrophysics is clearly something that's very significant, just for the reasons you mentioned. We want to understand. There are many. I think this common people. I think we shouldn't common people or whatever is not even. We should be careful about that. And people are able to understand and appreciate many of these things if you make an effort. I think that's my thing.
Very. Let us give a young man this chance. Yeah. What's your question?
My question is, why did Pluto go?
Great. Actually, you should have attended our last two Chai&Whys. One was given by Devjyoti and the other one was given by Jo Nina. You should have attended. You missed it. But anyway, I think Suvrat can answer it. No.
Devjyoti answer it.
Go ahead. Yeah, please. Answer him first.
Answer question of,
I mean, we can do this later, I guess.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay, so Pluto, the problem with Pluto is that, it crosses...
Let everybody hear it, loud and clear.
Yeah, the problem with Pluto is that it crosses Neptune's orbit, and there are many Pluto-like bodies in and around
But
vicinity.
I know something of Pluto.
So-
Just went on the solar system and it became a space stone.
Well, we are all space stones. All the planets are.
Ravi, wait a minute. No.
So, recently when Dr. Venkatraman Ramakrishnan became the president of the Royal Society, he gave an interview to a newspaper saying that scientific temper is the word used in the Indian Constitution, and it is only the Indian Constitution that mentions it. I mean, no other constitution or other country in the world does it. But he says that it has not changed ever since we got independence.
So the scientific temper is a much later constitutional amendment. It's an amendment actually done in the 70s at the Indira Gandhi. So I would in fact say that this idea of the scientific temper being put in it's true. I think that we are rather unique in that, and it's somewhat useful. I think that we have it. It has good uses. When it was put in, I would say it in fact had something of a condescending tone to it. The idea that the government of India or whatever, which at that time was extremely autocratic, as we all know, in the late 70s, needs to educate these common people or whatever, these people who are and inculcate a spirit of scientific temper in them. So it's actually it's a much later thing. It's not something that was part of the original constitution. It's something that's come later. But okay, in some sense, it's certainly something that people have been working towards, and the fact that it's there is certainly. I mean, it's Now, I don't know what the spirit it was made in. Now it's something to put to good use.
I think.
I think the debates like what people talk about here about the right versus the left. I think even if people follow the US, there's a huge debate between creationism and evolutionism as to whether it's usually taught in school. So I think worldwide there is a sort of a conflict that is always going to be there and always going to exist. What are the probably since you've studied in the US and probably how is the US actually tackling this issue? Because I know, for example, the GOP is something which is very hard on the whole thing on creationism and against the evolution part of it. And now you can actually see in the presidential elections, the voices becoming more sharper and more acute on some of these things. But how is it that the scientists in the US are handling it? Okay, there are a lot of big scientific institutions like MIT, Caltech, and all these kind of institutions. So how is it that the scientists in the US are handling it? And what is it that, I'm not saying that you can probably just take a leap out of that because India is a very, very different country from there. But just from a curiosity perspective, how is it that they are handling it?
I feel that this debate of creationism and is something what I would like to classify into this into the same category as the head transplant or the Viman. It's really that kind of a debate. It's not like there is any serious scientific evidence for creationism or for intelligent design or something. So now if there's some religious motivation for pushing an agenda of this kind, it's an agenda. It's certainly an important fight to be had. One should have the fight. In the long run, I have no doubt actually that those people will lose. Now, there is an important fight to be had, certainly. The issue of in general, right? But there are other issues I feel that again don't come up, and the issues that we spoke about. Even issues of, since we talked about nuclear energy, very similar issues exist in the US. So there is this liability law that some of us discussed also exists in the US. That's not something that's brought about and that's on the table and that's discussed as well. So I think there are all issues of defense, so even beside defense and so on, which scientists have raised, but there's much more that can be said about it. So I think there are many scientific issues there as well which are under the table. This particular issue, I would say, is something that is really at the level of fighting obscurantism, which is a battle that's important, but which the obscurantists will lose. I really think they will lose.
How do they go about it? But how do the scientists actually go about it?
The scientists are going about that, you see, because it's a question of someone deciding, having to spend the time and energy of debating these arguments and of having these debates, which one can have. They're not. In fact, I feel the climate change debate is a more interesting one. It's a more interesting one because there are much more sophisticated interests that are involved in that debate. In the debate on creationism, this is my really there are no very significant economic interests. There's some religious, social obscurantist viewpoint that's pushing it. But in the debate on climate change, there are very significant economic interests that are involved. So I find that on the debate on climate change, there's much more sophisticated rhetoric that comes from climate change deniers than comes from people who are involved in intelligent design. So in some sense, that's a debate which requires, I think, a lot more effort than I think the debate on creationism and evolution is on evolution. Yeah.
So you said the money is there in science, but there are not many proposals. But how much of the taxpayers' money, how much percentage goes to research, which is very minuscule compared to other countries? Like, instead of creating these manufacturing corridors, why can't we have, like, SMEs are being funded by the government in the euro to do research? They take on PhD students. Why can't we have that kind of? And also one more.
Because it could be a person.
Absolutely. That is the big issue that's pending. That there is no such thing as Indian industry.
And my question is not finished. 1 minute. And you said if you're socially responsible scientists, the argument is that it will lead to the paralysis of your research. I mean, how much is? Because I want to be a socially responsible scientist, I worry that will it affect my research projects, the time I'm giving to my research. So is that, like, what's the argument?
I think the issue of greater spending on actually not just on research but also generally on education is something that can certainly be made. Even forget about research, even just on primary education, which leads up to that. There's for long been understood that if one spends about 6% of GDP on that, one will succeed very rapidly, and not only eradicating illiteracy, but in general having a very great improvement in primary education. It's very simple, just some back of the envelope calculations actually will lead you to the 6% of GDP figure, which has been understood for a long time. There's even, this, but I think that successive governments have not prioritized that. In fact, as you know, funding on education as a function of GDP has dropped. So absolute numbers have risen, but actually as a function of GDP, it's actually dropped. So that's certainly a case that needs to be made. As part of that, I think there has to be a greater case to be made for funding on basic research, which has to come hand in hand with funding on education and greater funding in primary education as well. It's a debate that really has to do with the interests that are served. So clearly, there's an interest that's served if you go and you buy, so many aircraft from France, and various people stand to make money, whereas people may not stand to make money if you decide to expand greatly the primary school education network. So it's a fight that needs to be had. I completely agree with that. It's a case that needs to be made. I don't actually feel that this issue that it will paralyze your research is actually a very valid issue. this is just something, my personal take on this, but it's a very tricky argument, because you'll find often in science, if you're involved in music, for example, you're doing music, that's something that's great. It's so great that you're spending time doing music, and you're such a great musician as well as scientist. If you're involved in doing hiking or you're mountaineering or so on, that's so great. But if you're involved in doing, if you're involved in social issues, then that's not so great. That becomes a waste of time, and then you suddenly need to ask these questions. So I don't feel that it's really true, that it's that it will paralyze. So I think that, yeah.
But is it not true that any scientific inquiry on thought requires a certain amount of putting on blunders and just focusing on that to lead to a certain conclusion? And that involving in anything else can also actually impede that movement that is often cumulative in the reaching of that.
Maybe it's even true that if you were, maybe it's even true that, well, first of all, I'm not sure that it's the case that, in general, scientists have a lot of freedom over how they allocate their time to people who are involved in active science. And I think it's not true from a practical perspective that one can't find time to be engaged in these issues. But maybe it's true, maybe in some extreme sense it's true that if all of us were to totally forget about everything else and just focus on science, it would enhance scientific research. But for what? If in the end there's some, if in the end there are other significant social costs to an activity of this kind, which breaks off scientists from society, it's not clear, and that leads to some abstract enhancement of science, and more papers get published or more something happens. It's not clear that that's a socially desirable outcome. So it's not, even if one could make a case, and I think that's a hard case to make, that making scientists disjoint from society would enhance scientific productivity. Even then, it's not clear that that's a socially desirable outcome.
Going along with what he said, there is a certain personality type that is suited for each of us can excel in some things in our life, not in everything. Each of us did what we excel in, and so people who are based on scientific proper researchers, they whereas people who are geared up mentally and their thought process to fight for social causes, if they work on that, and if we did what they were good at, wouldn't that be a better?
I'm not sure that this kind of compartmentalization actually succeeds. And in fact, I find that it's precisely this kind of compartmentalization that allows powerful interests to game the system. Because they realize that there may be scientists who could do this basic data analysis, but who won't actually do it. There may actually even be economists who could do, say, cost analysis, but won't actually do it because that's too inflating. You don't want to spend your time doing accounting for how much a power project will cost. It's much more interesting to build some models of how, some abstract models of how the economy will function. So I think the fact that there is this ultra-specialization leads to a systemic weakness in the society, which is certainly exploited. And so I'm not sure that this ultra-specialization, where there is a set of scientists who do science and then there's a set of social reformers who do social reform, would possibly work. I feel that intellectuals have to have a public responsibility, and it's very important.
Sorry. I think we'll have a last question. It's past 1 o'clock.
It's just, I just didn't get his answer to her question on how much taxpayers' money goes into research. That's all I wanted to know.
I don't know the exact figures actually on what is the percentage.
They've been trying to take it to 3%. They've not been able to for the last infinite years.
Absolute amount may have gone up, but in terms of GDP, the percentage has certainly come down.
So less than 1%.
It's
no, I can't give you the percentage. I do not find it out.
It's about 1.5%, and they're trying to take it to 3%. And they've not been able to do it for the last 15 years.
Let's have the last question.
This is actually not a question because he posed the relevant question there and made us think. So this is just a suggestion to the DIFR Chai&Why forum. Why not to dedicate one session, maybe once in 3 months or once in 6 months, that's a matter of decision, on one topic and have a debate. So you can take global warming, you can take, if it is fitting within the scope that you guys are having, have a topic and have an open debate.
Thanks for the suggestion. Unfortunately, our mandate is to take science and the excitement of science to the public, and we are trying to do the best that we can. And we try to, once in a while, we'll certainly have people like Suvrat Raju who talk on policies. As he bluntly agreed that many of the scientists, they are not really involved by any policy maker in taking many decisions which require inputs of such kind. Now, we have person among this last 7 years who can contribute, and we got it for you. So I really do not know whether we can.
Topic. We will debate. You can
That they can't. No, they have their job is to push their.
Vijay Devjoti, both are here from the outreach committees. Do you want to increase our of nightmare? No. I don't think so. They will agree to this.
No, but you can have the debate on the Chai&Why Facebook page. That's a fantastic.
We can start up. Okay, fine. What you can do is, like Vineet just now suggested the topic for the next Chai&Why. We took it up. We will take up whatever is possible from our end, and we can set the ball rolling for you. You can always visit the Facebook the Chai&Why Facebook page and start it. We'll try to keep on moderating it. No problem.
Maybe other data institutes can be
We
involved.
can definitely talk about it.
Yeah. We can.
We find enough people to
Yes.
discussing.
Yeah. We can, if you can sustain it and we can moderate it, we'll certainly go ahead with it. Okay, this particular Chai&Why may not have been geared up for the young generation, but next two are certainly is about rainbows, halos and glories. There are some misconceptions about rainbows and the circular rainbows and whether they are rainbows at all or not. We'll try to demystify those things. The next is joy of creative laziness. This is funny thing. If you are creative, you cannot be lazy. If you are lazy, you cannot. So these two things, the parents are requested to bring their kids to this particular two talks and many more to come. I would like to thank Suvrat for a fantastic talk. There is sort of disagreement, but we agree to disagree and continue. Thank you very much.